Welcome back, Weirdos and Weeboos, to Undercards, where today I'm going to be showing off one of the most budgety of budget decks. This is going to be extremely affordable to make if you are a new player, and it should work even at high ranks. And possibly one of the best parts about this deck is not only do you not need to have many high rarity cards, it's all either base cards that you get for free or common cards that you can very easily obtain. But on top of that, the deck is extremely malleable. There's a bunch of cards in this deck that could easily be replaced by other cards that do similar things, and the deck could still function just fine. Which means even if there are commons in this deck that you don't own, and you don't particularly want to go out your way to craft, even though they're extremely cheap, the vast majority of them are going to have alternatives that you probably do own that you can run without much sacrifice to the performance of the deck. In fact, it might be better than the original, because I haven't tried every possible combination of cards you could use in this deck, because there's a lot of different ways you could use this deck. But essentially, this is a Justice tempo deck. It's kind of somewhere in between mid-range and aggro, leaning more towards aggro, but definitely not as aggressive as a lot of the other aggro decks around right now that are especially fast. Essentially, the inspiration behind this deck was quite simply that I realized that I said that Dumpster was an amazing card, and yet I'd gone this far into the set without ever using it. I just hadn't really thought to use it yet, and so I started to try and build a deck where I would use it, and that didn't really require me to run that many base cards, but the first thing I thought of was just almost every base card fits really nicely into an aggressive deck, so why don't I just make an aggressive deck with lots of base cards? And then I realized, why don't I just make it basically all base cards? There isn't really much of a reward for making it all base cards, but it does mean that the deck is much more budget. And I thought, maybe this isn't enough synergy, maybe this deck needs more synergy than this to work, but honestly, no, it kind of already works. Now that being said, I said that this should work to higher ranks. I will say that Legend players seem to be very good at beating this deck. It's kind of funny actually, it feels like every single time I match up against someone who is Diamond or lower, I win with this deck, and every single time I match up against someone who's Legend, I always seem to lose. That means that the win rate for this deck was a little skewed for me. But whenever I played it, whenever I got demoted from Legend from losing too many games, I would start plowing through every game. So I'm pretty sure it's just a Legend thing. And I think it comes down to just that in Legend there's a lot more people experimenting because they've already got to Legend. And I feel like one of the reasons this deck is so effective at the moment is because I would say it does have a good matchup against a lot of the people trying to climb with aggro. For this deck, you need two artifacts. The Poke artifact, which I'm pretty sure you should have for free from the very start of the game, so you don't even need to buy that one. And the Noodles artifact, which you will have to buy, but if I remember right, that's only 300 gold, so well worth it, because I've said it before and I'll say it again, I think that Noodles is generally the best artifact in the game. You can replace Poke with something else. In fact, at first, since I thought this is a bit more of a mid-rangey deck, I genuinely tried Veteran before I tried Poke, because I thought that it might be more effective with this deck. But what I found was I kept having games where I got people down to their last 3 points of health, and then they make their comeback, and it's like, if I had just run Poke, they would have been dead there. And sure enough, I definitely started doing better once I switched the Veteran out for Poke. I was rarely finding the time to be able to make those trades anyway. Even though this is leaning a bit towards mid-range, this is still overall a relatively aggressive deck that you want to play relatively fast with. And although it's nice to take good trades and get attack buffs from them, it's just not fast enough for this deck. You usually give your opponent's deck too much time to make a comeback if you spend time doing that. As for why the soul for this deck is Justice, it just comes down to the fact that Justice has a good passive for the most part. This deck basically does not run any spells, and although I could run the "oh, you are running no spells" cards to take advantage of that, Bookshelf is a little bit slow for this deck, and Rudolph heals, and we don't need healing in this deck, so it just feels like there's no point in running those cards. So that means that instead I'm just choosing to not run very many spells at all because they're not really needed for this deck. Again, you're really focused on just minion combat and just getting big things on the board. The one spell that I thought could be useful was, as you could see, Punishment, just to deal 4 damage to an enemy. Because this deck doesn't really have that much board control, and although it shouldn't need much, it is going to play for the board, so even though it's not a control deck, it probably would like to have some tools to quickly deal with.
Now I am free to roam this earth.
That said, there is absolutely no obligation for you to play this deck as Justice. You could do this as just about any other soul and just replace the 2 punishments. Honestly, it might even be better to run this deck as Bravery, but I chose Justice just because the spell that I would use in Justice is a base spell. Alright, so I said that a lot of the cards in this deck are very replaceable, so let's start with the few cards I would say you really can't replace in this deck. Obviously 3 copies of Dumpster, which of course is a common, and I'm also running 2 copies of Starwalker Bird. You can run 3, but when I was running 3, I ran into the problem of some games drawing too many of them, and since they are the most expensive card in the deck, and they draw more cards, it was just too slow. So I'm only running 2, but it's kind of hard to balance these things because they are also one of the most powerful cards in the deck in the right situation, so it feels like I should be running 3, but as I say, running 3 I just seem to get dead hands. This card is another common, and it's a 6 cost 5/6 that if you have no rare or epic cards in our deck, which, well, I think we've satisfied that condition, you draw 3 cards when you play it. This, alongside Dumpster, will be your only card draw, at least in this version of the deck, but 3 cards is a lot, so it should be the only card draw you need. I'm also running the alternative to that card, Starwalker, the 4 cost 4/5 that also, if you have no rare or epic cards, will choose a card in your hand and send it back to your deck costing 4 less. This card is not necessarily important in this deck, especially because sometimes you can have to play it at a really nasty time where you've barely got any cards in your hand and you play this and it forces you to put a card back in your deck. But it also helps balance things out. If you have a Starwalker Bird that you want to play but your hand is too full, you can use this to obviously help empty your hand while also playing a very stat efficient unit. 4 cost 4/5 is a very good stat line in this game. And if you do draw back that card that now costs 4 less, it's going to be a big tempo play. This is a bit of a weird one, honestly. As I say, if you have card draw to go with it, or you get lucky enough to instantly get back the card that you discounted, this card will be well worth it and will really help you get on the board. But if you don't have that happen, it's actually going to be quite a liability a lot of the time. So certainly you do not need this card to make this deck work. You can definitely run this deck without this card, but I'm just running it with it because it feels like it makes sense in the deck. Again, good stat line, a possibility to give me a big tempo boost. It is only a possibility, but as an aggressive deck, you kind of want to take chances to get ahead. But anyway, the only other cards in this deck I would say are a must are the 3 Ice Caps, just because Ice Cap is really, really good, and the 3 Charleses, because Charles is really, really good. And you also want to play those with your Noodles if you can help it, because obviously you want to buff these guys up so they get more use out of their armor. There's not much to it really. Charles is just a very, very powerful aggressive card. You don't even have to really run a deck filled with buffs. As long as you're running some kind of buffs in the form of Noodles, that's good enough. So those are the cards that you need. What about the other cards I put in the deck? Well, the only other common I put in the deck is Overlord Megosp, which isn't necessary because I mentioned this is a base card deck, so you could very easily just run Froggets instead or Mold Smalls instead. Probably Froggets because Charles already kind of has a Mold Small stat line. Or you could even run Tiny Froggets if you own Tiny Froggets. But the reason I'm running Overlord Megosp is because I found that a lot of the time I would struggle to stick a unit on the board in Legend. I mentioned that a lot of Legend players were kind of experimenting, and so they were playing decks that were much better at controlling the board. Since control is kind of bad against most of the decks on ladder now, it seems like most Legend players are finding ways to make control work, and I can respect that, but also it's annoying because it screws over this deck. So yeah, if you are running into people who have got decks that are really well equipped to just wipe whatever you play at the start of the game, then Overlord Megosp is probably one of the best cards that you would want in this deck, because obviously it will come back if they kill it and you'll get way more value from it. That being said, it's also not crazy aggressive, and sometimes that means that it makes the game a little bit too slow since it doesn't have that much attack, and it's not really that threatening unless you go out of your way to buff it. I've already mentioned Punishment. I'm running Scarf Mouse for a similar reason. Scarf Mouse can obviously just silence a unit, and this is mostly used to get through taunts, but also you can also use it to prevent passive abilities that you couldn't prevent just with what's on your board from triggering. I kind of wanted to run 3 of these because these are a really good card that is a base card, but they are just too small on their own, considering again this is supposed to be an aggressive deck. And to be fair, usually Scarf Mice are going to be really good in every deck, but this is one of the few decks where they aren't really that crazy, just because the only thing you really want to silence is taunts. Usually, if you're silencing anything else, you're playing a bit too slow. But that's not all the time, and when you do hit a silence on something significant that isn't a taunt, it can be absolutely massive. And of course, even if you silence something that is a taunt, if that gives you lethal that turn, well, it's just won you the game. I'm running 3 Whimsons because, honestly, I just think they are very effective in this deck. They're obviously almost always a 3 cost 4/4, sometimes a 3 cost 5/4, because of the fact this deck obviously loves to put loads of stuff on the board, and this is a nice cheap unit you can just snack down and get some good stats. And really that's what this deck is all about. And then I'm also running 2 Magics, which are the last card in the deck. Now this is a bit of a weird one really, because I actually chose to use Magics instead of Snowdrakes, and I'm still not sure if it's better to use Snowdrakes or Magic. So Snowdrakes can obviously give attack buffs to your monsters on board, which can give you the burst damage you need to close out the game, but Magic has the potential to give you way more burst damage if used in the right situation. So yeah, it's kind of a bit of a difficult choice between the two of them. But I think, considering I didn't realise that Magic clearly seems to have been buffed since last time I used him, because he used to cost 5 and now he costs 4, I think I wanted to go with Magic because he does have a very nice stat line, even ignoring his ability. The only problem with Magic in this deck is, to be fair, almost none of the cards I'm running are very good to swap the stats of, just like on their own. Like for example, if I swap the stats of an Ice Cap, why would I do that? It would make it have 1 attack. So the majority of cards in this deck really don't get much from having their stats swapped, which is one of the only reasons that I'm a little bit iffy on whether I should have Magic or not. But usually your cards will get partially damaged, and then you can like swap their stats to keep them alive when they should have died. That's especially powerful with Charles. I mentioned Charles just absolutely dominates the board if you get him down early on and get noodles on him. If your opponent starts to damage him and you think that next turn they can kill him, you can just switch him from like a 5-2, assuming he took 1 damage with the armor. You could swap him into a 2-5 and now they are not going to kill him. It's also another way to get through enemy taunts, because usually they're going to have more health than attack, and you can just swap it round so they now have less health, and usually that's enough to get through them. I should mention there's also another card that you could run in this deck, which would be much more effective with Magic, and I actually really debated trying to force it into this deck, but I ran out of deck slots really fast, and I really couldn't make an argument for myself for this card replacing any other card that's already in this deck. But I was tempted to put Ice in this deck. Even though Ice is not a very aggressive card and is just kind of meh, it is something that's very powerful to Magic. That's 5 instant burst damage, and obviously it can help protect your other units very strongly. The problem is that I feel like this deck doesn't have enough like engine units that your opponent really has to do something about as soon as possible to make the Ice worthwhile. If you're running things like timers in this deck, which to be fair I think you can run. I don't remember if timer is a common off the top of my head or not, but if it is, you could run timer, I guess, and that's something that your opponent really has to kill straight away. You could use ices to prevent them from getting to them and then suddenly switch the ices around for burst damage. But, you know, now we're kind of really changing the deck quite a lot. This is kind of what I meant when I said this deck is very, very reshapeable. There's so many different directions you can take it while it's still going to be a kind of aggressive mid-rangey deck. If you do find yourself getting empty hands too often, and because there are only 3 cards that draw cards in this deck, but those 3 card draw cards are really good, I do find that this deck does sometimes get empty hands, although it doesn't happen that often. Then I could recommend using Fishing Rod. That's a base card with a decent stat line that draws you an extra card every turn it lives. Aaron would seem like a fine card to put in this deck, but remember you're running Dumpster, which is just Aaron but better, so I would say you don't really need Aaron in this deck. Vulcan is a burst damage option, but Snowdrake really outclasses them because it has a better stat line, especially for aggressive purposes, and the only downside to Snowdrakes is that you need a monster on the board that can attack for the 2 burst damage to go through. But if you don't have a single monster on the board to get that 2 attack buff on and smack into something, then you're probably not playing this deck right. The last base card that I would say is probably a big consideration for this deck is Dad Slime. And to be fair, I do like the look of it in theory. It is a very sticky unit that's going to keep multiple units on the board, which is going to help keep the Winsons around, and just generally is going to make it very hard for your opponent to win trades on the board. The problem is, it costs 7 and it only has 5 attack. I already mentioned how Starwalker birds are a little too slow in this deck, and those only cost 6. So I definitely think you can run Dad Slime, but if you start running Dad Slime, you have to realize that now you're not really running that much of an aggressive deck. You're really kind of leaning into the mid-range now. Now, that doesn't mean the deck is straight away bad, but I do think that full-on mid-range generally does seem to do kind of bad. I say this deck leans a little bit towards mid-range, and the reason why I do that, even though I say that I think like mid-range is kind of bad in general, is because Dumpster kind of forces us to. It's a very good card, but it's 5 cost, and it's not something that does something instantly, so that means that it does start to kind of go into the mid-range. And again, this deck made so much sense with Starwalker Bird, which is the other most expensive card in this deck, which knocks it towards mid-range. So that is why this deck is a little bit mid-range in the first place. I think it's best when this deck is a little bit mid-range, because to be fair, it being mid-range means it usually has bigger monsters than what the aggro decks are playing, and so it usually gets very good trades with aggro decks, which means you can just steamroll them. But if the aggro decks you're playing have enough over-the-top burst damage that doesn't care about what's happening on the board, if they're kind of aggro burn decks, like for instance
Gemstones,
then you do kind of get plowed if you're playing this deck. So the slight leaning into mid-range does help against most aggro decks, but whenever you run into ones that have more over-the-top damage, you do start to lose a lot more. And that's why I think if you really start to lean heavily into the mid-range, you probably lose to even decks with only a teeny bit of burst damage that you really should be beating. One particularly bad matchup that I've been running into is a deck that a lot of Legend players have been playing that isn't Control, but still seems to be pretty difficult for this deck to beat, which is this Kindness Tentacle Duplication deck. Essentially, there's a spell that gives you the left and right tentacle that Kindness has that usually you would get from Onion-san. And yeah, it's actually pretty good because the Tentacle's abilities is that when they die, one of them heals you for 3 and one of them deals 3 damage. This deck runs ways to trigger those dust effects multiple times, as well as ways to duplicate those tentacles so they can continue to do them. And 3 burst damage is actually pretty good for the price you get it. So basically what I'm getting at is, yeah, these tentacles kind of mess you up. This matchup is very frustrating because it feels like you can't win. If you try to go at them and really try and end the game early, which is probably the best course of action, you'll have to deal with them duplicating their healing, so you will probably not get the reach you need from just ice caps. But then of course, if you try to actually build a board and win through tempo, then they will just not care about your board, drop down a whole bunch of those tentacles that deal direct damage instead of healing, and just keep hitting you with direct damage until you're dead. There isn't really a surefire way to beat this deck, but as I say, the best strategy seemed to be to just run at them. Just go full on aggro. They're going to try and heal, and you just have to see if you can take enough risks and get lucky enough that you can kill them early enough that the healing isn't enough. It's a pretty rough matchup, but as you can see, you can win it. This is one of the only games I played against that deck where I won. Again, even though you're kind of supposed to counter this deck because it's aggressive, it's kind of like the pickaxe. It's aggro burn kind of hybrid, really, and the burn is what gets you. Speaking of aggro burn, yeah, Gemstones is also a pretty bad matchup for this deck. But I mean, I don't hold that against this deck because I'm pretty sure just about every deck has a bad matchup against Gemstones except decks that spam long sinks. Let's stop beating around the bush though. What's the actual win rate of this deck? It's 8 and 7. Now I know that isn't a crazy impressive win rate, but it's still positive. And again, I wanted to show this deck regardless because I think that that win rate is kind of skewed to more losses because of the fact that I feel this deck is more effective against people who are not a legend. I know this sounds kind of like a really dumb, obvious thing. Of course, you're going to lose more often to legend players. But I think it comes down to a couple things. Not only the fact that I mentioned that legend players are playing very different decks to people that are climbing, but also the fact that, well, obviously legend players are more experienced. This deck is going to absolutely steamroll the less experienced players for the most part. And while you might think that any half-decent deck can do that, this deck especially is very secure in getting its wins, as long as it's not against someone who is very experienced with dealing with these kinds of aggressive decks. Obviously, it'd be better if this was a deck that worked with more than just a barely positive win rate at all ranks, but at the same time, this deck is also a budget deck, as in it is made for newer players. And newer players, this is kind of exactly what they need. A deck that's going to have short games so they can climb fast, that is going to steamroll the people that it will beat, so when they do win, they're going to have quick games. And again, most of the people playing this deck are not going to be at Legend. I'm not even saying that means they're bad or anything, but a lot of them are probably going to be at Ruby or Diamond, and that's a respectable rank. But it's still like, most people at Ruby and Diamond do seem to get steamrolled by this deck. As well as that, the win rate is slightly negatively skewed by the fact that this is counting the games when I still hadn't really figured out what I was doing with this deck. If you take out the games where I was running Veteran and not Poke, which again I really think was a mistake, then the win rate is actually 6 and 4, which is obviously a little better. So any new players out there, good luck with this deck. But one last thing, some of you might have been a little bit disappointed. There's a Spamton in the thumbnail, but there isn't a Spamton in the deck. Yeah, I just wanted to do Spamton for the haha funny cheap deals. But hey, you haven't been completely clickbaited, because you can very easily put Spamton in this deck, even though he is a legendary. If you own him, you can put him in, because the Starwalker bird condition only applies to rares and epics, so you can run legendaries. I'm only not running a legendary here because really there actually isn't really a legendary you want to run with this deck for the most part. I mean, it's a tempo deck, and it's quite an early game one too, and most legendaries are kind of mid-late game kind of cards. The only one you could really run would be Sans Dog, but even that one is like, it's a 1-1. Well, I say the only one, I'm about to say you can run Spamton, obviously. Spamton makes a little bit more sense because he's got a very good aggressive stat line. Although I will say I don't think the best version of the deck should run him. It's just his ability. It's not something this deck should need for the most part. It's a slow burn and this deck does not want to be slow. That being said, if you really are getting screwed by combo decks, and I doubt you are, but if you really are, then technically teching in a Spamton would not be a bad idea. Other than that, stop deluding yourself. You just want to put Spamton in because it'd be fun. Go ahead and do it, I don't care. Hey, could we, like, finish the job on that?